So this is my reading, commentary, and reflection on the Platonic dialogue, the Sophist. This happens to be part 7 of this series. And what an interesting journey it has been. You know, whenever I start a new episode, I sort of debate whether or not I should cover an extensive amount of ground or just sort of get right back into it. Of late, I've been going right back into where I left off at the previous part, but I'll give a small introduction. The general structure of this dialogue, it is between two interlocutors. We have the visitor from a Greek colony in Italy that is Elean, I believe, from Elea. And we have Theaetetus, who is an Athenian youth. They are talking about a particular person, the person of the Sophist. And they use the language of going on a hunt to find him. We've established a few things about the nature of the Sophist. That he has a particular type of expertise. An expertise in a type of knowledge, let's say, in persuasion. He's somebody that makes money from his pursuits. He is somebody that is both within and without societies. He may be transient or he may be local to a particular city. He is somebody that gains pupils to himself, and he teaches them in a particular way. Though the Sophist is a type of philosopher that wishes to know, his knowing seems to come up short, and his existence is propelled forward by the ignorance of others until they come to the realization that he is not really teaching them anything. And so the initial part of this dialogue focused on that interesting, imaginative pursuit of the Sophist. And then we fell into this deep discussion about being and non-being, that which is and that which is not, about oneness and multiplicity, about change, and about rest. And so, with this in mind, this is where we will continue. But again, I recommend, if one is to be confused about where I start here, that you pick up from the first episode and follow it all the way through, as tedious as it might be. And if it's not quite obvious, I live on a busy street, so that background noise that you hear will be cars passing and police and fire trucks, ambulance, all of this goes by. It also happens to be raining, so we get that added ambiance, I guess we can say, of the cars that drive over the wet road. So starting with the visitor here. Well then, he says, what if we admit that everything has the capacity to associate with everything else? Theaetetus says, I can solve that one. How? Because if change and rest belong to each other, then change would be completely at rest, and conversely rest itself would be changing. The visitor responds, but I suppose it's ruled out by very strict necessity that change should be at rest and that rest should change. Theaetetus says, of course. And here is the point where we left off last time. I went through the interpretation of Theaetetus's bit about if change and rest belong to each other, etc., etc., but I have yet to talk about what the visitor proposed here. But I suppose this ruled out by very strict necessity that change should be at rest, and that rest should change. Now, part of the difficulty, I think, when we enter into a philosophical discussion, especially if we haven't been there from the beginning, or if a day passes and we have to re-enter into some new discussion, I think it's useful to think about some practical examples. It's useful to develop that proverbial landscape in the sense that we use our imagination, in a sense, not to deceive ourselves, but rather to provide a fertile substrate such that the seeds that we plant, or the seeds that we are given by the dialogue, may be planted and grown within us, so we can be participants in the dialogue rather than passive consumers. Now, one of the themes that has come up in my reflection on this dialogue is the concept of identity. And it can be a difficult one to approach, an interesting one to approach, especially these days. And I think we all know why, in more ways than one. But when we think of change, we think of something that goes from one state to another. There are many things that change. I can be looking straight out my window, and there's a small sliver between this interestingly beautiful brick building. It's an old museum. It used to be an old police station. At the top of which there are these interesting archways, and just generally the architecture is kind of interesting. It's something that's not really seen in a typical American landscape. And I happen to live on the 4th floor of the building, so I'm a bit high up. And as I peer out my window, I see the edge of this building. And just to its left, I see a tree. Just beyond the tree is that busy road that I had mentioned in the beginning. And this small sliver between the tree and the building, I can see the road. And as I blink, I imagine myself taking these small snapshots of the road. And as a matter of change, there can be although the image is relatively the same, there can be small changes in terms of the wind blowing the branches, the wind blowing the branches such that they interfere with the street light across the way, so I no longer can see the street light. Or there can be quite large changes. Behind the tree there's a flagpole, and there's an American flag. It may blow in front of that narrow gap through which I can see the street. A car may be driving by, and since the sun is setting now, even though it's overcast, it's still fairly light. The headlamps of the cars are on, and I can see them driving past that small little viewable passageway. And so I say all of this to paint a picture, but also to say that in a given instant, one image may change. One snapshot of a blink, let's say a blink of the eye. And I mention this because I think it represents change well. That we can see something that has a degree of constancy. It doesn't have to be this way, but I'll expand it in a moment. We can imagine something with a degree of constancy, and then there is something that is introduced, or something that is taken away. I can blink once where a car is passing, blink again, and there's nothing. And yet, in the sense of identity, where we are concerned about sameness, there is a general consistency of the landscape, regardless of the small changes that occur from here and there. Now, there can be an event, like a flood, an earthquake, or a bomb that goes off that would dramatically change this landscape. And in that way, the identity, I think, would shift from one thing to another. The degree of change affects what it is, what the landscape offers, what its purpose is, how people participate with it, how the different things in general participate with each other. So in this way, I think we can see that in terms of a thing, an identity, like the image that's outside of my bedroom window, or if I pick up this penny from the table, it has its own identity. It has its own set of characteristics that make it what it is, that's separate from other things. We can see that there can be change that is introduced into the system and not change the identity or the name of the thing, but also there can be enough change that's introduced to change the identity of the thing, to give it a different name, let's say. And so the visitor says, it's ruled out by very strict necessity that change should be at rest, and that rest should change. Now this is a fairly straightforward and simple observation, but nonetheless I think it's important to think about. Now what would it necessarily mean for change to be at rest? I think it would mean that change itself has assumed the name of rest, that it assumed a different identity. And for a thing that is, it's impossible to take on an identity of something else without being that thing. So for example, we take the change that has occurred between one picture and another. It would be impossible to put the pictures together and say they are the same picture, because they're not. There are two obvious differences between them. Let's say the car is passing in one picture, and in the other they are not. This example is a bit limited, of course, because we're talking about a picture. Both of the pictures are at rest. But if we just take one to be the standard, the identity of reference, then I think we can see better how this might play out. And the same is true for rest and change. Now the visitor says the third option is the only one left. He says certainly one of the following things has to be the case. Either everything is willing to blend, or nothing is, or some things are, and some are not. Now this blending is the fundamental concept. This is the intricate detail that allows identities to exist while also allowing change to occur. This is our integration between being and non-being, or thingness and nothingness, or no-thingness. We are all familiar, surely, with certain physiological processes of the body, that cells regenerate and they replace old and dying cells. And this may happen at a rate eventually where we can pick a snapshot in time where the cells that once were are no longer, and we occupy an entirely new substrate of cells. And this new substrate of cells is functioning in a similar manner as the old ones. So they still maintain the identity, but there has been quite a dramatic shift and a dramatic change. Theaetetus says, of course. The visitor says, and we found that the first two options were impossible. Yes, says Theaetetus. So everyone who wants to give the right answer will choose the third. Absolutely. Since some will blend and some won't, there will be a good deal like letters of the alphabet. Some of them fit together with each other and some don't. Of course. More than the other letters, the vowels run through all of them like a bond, linking them together, so that without a vowel, no one of the others can fit with another. So let's reflect on this for a moment. The letters of the alphabet. I think about these. Well, the first thought that comes to mind is the Platonic dialogue Cratylus. This is one of the foundational dialogues that helps us sort through the concept of etymology, the etymology of words, where the meaning of words comes from. But when we consider these building blocks, we consider elements that are fundamentally necessary to form an identity. We can say of the letters themselves that they have an identity, but it's a basic identity. It's an identity that we know obviously participates in some broader one. I think we can say the same of words as well. Some words are more complex, some are quite simple, but together they can create quite sophisticated ideas. And even of sentences, we can say the same, and we can just keep on going this way. Though at some point we can say that further complexity probably wouldn't help us all that much, and there's more that has to do in some Goldilocks zone of enough information to convey that which is important, so to avoid all of the noise, the background noise, let's say. More than the other letters, the vowels run through all of them like a bond, linking them together, so that without a vowel, no one of the others can fit with another. So this is a bit confusing to me, and I'd like to use our AI tool to help us understand what the purpose of vowels are, so we can understand what the visitor is saying here. So I'm going to do some reading, and this is going to come together over time. A vowel is a speech sound produced without significant constrictions of airflow in the vocal tract. In contrast to consonants, which involve blocking or restricting airflow with the lips, tongue, teeth, etc., vowels are open sounds. In writing systems like English, the letters A, E, I, O, U, sometimes Y, typically represent vowel sounds. The purpose of vowels. To make speech audible and fluid, vowels act as acoustic cores of syllables. Every syllable must have a vowel or a vowel-like sound. They carry the vocal tone, pitch, and volume of speech, making speech legible to the ear. So for example, the word cat consists of K, a consonant, it stops the airflow, a vowel, open sound, and T, a consonant, again, stops the airflow. The vowel a gives the word its voice and shape. Without it, speech would just be hisses and clicks. It enables word differentiation. Different vowel sounds are key in distinguishing between words. Bit, bet, bat. Consonants may remain the same, but vowels often determine meaning. They convey emotion, tone, and rhythm. Vowels play a major role in intonation, rising and falling pitch, stress and rhythm, musicality of language, expressiveness. The long O in no shows despair. They help us humanize language and shape its aesthetic quality, especially in poetry, singing, and public speaking. Many grammatical functions depend on vowel patterns. Run, ran, running, sing, sang, sung, song. In Semitic languages like Hebrew and Arabic, consonants form the root meaning, while vowel patterns determine tense, voice, or part of speech. Linguistic function. Vowels are carriers of meaningful sound. Vowels allow for syllabic structure. They are often the nucleus of a syllable. They act as the glue between consonants, enabling complex combinations to become pronounceable and meaningful. So this is our detour into the vowel structure, something that I had not really thought of or understood. But now that we know that, when the visitor says, more than the other letters, the vowels run through all of them like a bond, linking them together, so that without a vowel, no one of the others can fit with another. We can see the importance of the vowel, but more maybe symbolically here as we zoom out and we think about our original conversation about the identity of things. There is a certain affordance, it would seem. I can imagine in my mind potential realities that have underlying potential substrates. I had mentioned the principles that are necessary to form identity, or the basic identities to form more complex identities. I think a reality is made richer by those components, those fundamental components of the simpler identities that can interact in a complex manner to support the larger identities on top of them. Theaetetus responds, definitely. So does everyone know which kinds of letters can associate with which, or does it take an expert? Theaetetus says it takes an expert. The visitor says, what kind? An expert in grammar. Well then, isn't it the same with high and low notes? The musician is the one with the expertise to know which ones mix and which ones don't, and the unmusical person is the one who doesn't understand that. Theaetetus says yes. So let's pause here again for a moment and reflect on the nature of this expert. As I mentioned earlier, the introduction to this dialogue was heavily in terms of defining and understanding the expert. I wrote out this dialogical tree that followed where we were going, but it initially started with the concept of the expert. So the musician is the one that understands notes, these fundamental building blocks for which they can use to build an identity on top of it, convey an emotion through music that makes sense to the ear. The unmusical person is the one who does not possess the understanding of these fundamental building blocks to build those identities. But wouldn't it be nice if we all had such abilities? Of course, it takes discipline to master such things, and many other things like it. Well then, says the visitor, we've agreed that kinds mix with each other in the same way. So if someone's going to show us correctly which kinds of harmonies with which and which kinds exclude each other, doesn't he have to have some kind of knowledge as he proceeds through the discussion? And in addition, doesn't he have to know whether there are any kinds that run through all of them and link them together to make them capable of blending? And also, when there are divisions, whether certain kinds of running through holes are always the cause of the divisions. The ITDIS responds, "Of course, that requires knowledge, probably just about the most important kind." So we have to take another pit stop here and really digest what the visitor is saying. I suppose there's many ways that we can go about thinking about this practically in our own lives. Many of us have some expertise in something, even if it's quite simple. We know how to perform a task for work. We do it 8 hours or more every day. And so there's something that's learned there. There's something that we begin to understand that becomes fundamental, more and more fundamental over time. That is, if we pay attention to it. And I think there's something very important about what is being said here. Keeping in mind this idea of what we may do for work, or something that we know well, there's the idea of harmony and the idea of exclusion. Up until this point, we've been thinking about change and rest somewhat as separate terms, fundamental terms, but separate to a degree. But now we think about them in terms of harmony, or something that agrees, and something that excludes, something that puts up an impermeable barrier that is resistant to that change. And so we have these two levers, so to speak. When one is flipped on, you have this effect. When the other is flipped on, you have that effect. When they're both flipped on, you have this effect. If they're both closed, you have this effect. Sort of an image that comes to mind here is computing. At the simplest level, I think that these up and down, open and closed, 1 and 0 type binaries are fairly common. Doesn't he have to have some kind of knowledge as he proceeds through the discussion? Of course, if he is going to be able to use those principles of exclusion and harmony effectively, he may do it arbitrarily and still come to some reasonably sounding piece of music. He may be able to serve a reasonably tasting dish, but all the same, eventually, the lack of expertise will catch up to that experience. Because there's a variety of things that must be created in order to do a task well. And in addition, doesn't he have to know whether there are kinds that run through all of them and link them together to make them capable of blending? Here we think about our vowels, or in whatever professional context we happen to be in, those fundamental structural pieces of knowledge and information that we use to reason and to solve problems. And also, where there are divisions, whether certain kinds running through holes are always the cause of division. So that last bit, whether certain kinds running through holes are always the cause of the division. Certain principles, certain fundamental building blocks, certain vowels, certain processes maybe, the cause of division, the cause of separation, but also separation into something, possibly. And here I think about that bit, bet, bat situation, in which the cause of the division is the vowel. It's the I, it's the E, it's the A. So forgive me, but today is a new day, so I may retrace previous ground unintentionally, but going off of what I just mentioned about this, the idea of the vowel that, in the particular instance that I mentioned, having those three words, having them differ by the vowel that's in the middle, the consonants stay the same, but what's in the middle is like this river that flows, that carries the emotion, the meaning, and everything with it. And this idea is, at the same time, both a dividing force and also a unifier. It's a dividing force in the sense that it keeps the consonants apart, even though, and retain a different identity. But also, it keeps them together. It keeps them apart in the sense that they cannot exist together alone without that vowel. But at the same time, they find themselves existing together with that vowel. So that it's inherently divisional and attractive. So the visitor continues, "So, Theaetetus, what shall we label this knowledge? Or, for heaven's sake, without noticing we've stumbled on the knowledge that free people have? Maybe we found the philosopher even though we were looking for the sophist." Now, what would make him say such a thing? I think it's because of the fact that what we have stumbled upon is not necessarily a major inconsistency or a foundational error. And I'll go a step farther and say not so much an error as it is a deliberate mechanism put in place, perhaps in light of willful blindness or in light of true understanding, that it is placed within the gears of the mind such that the prime operating faculties that are necessary to solve something, to solve a problem, to come to some understanding that which is true, it is placed within these gears, and it is kept moving only so far as to give the sophist a free ride through the machine that produces life. That if the machine is to be like civilization, for example, the sophist has found himself in a very intelligent manner, let's say, feeding off of the minds of the young, such that he can maintain himself. But this sort of thing doesn't necessarily work when we are trying to explore freely. I have to be a little careful about my language here, because even that, it confuses me a bit, because the sophist can be a free thinker easily, or easily label himself a free thinker. But specifically, we're talking about somebody who has knowledge of the fundamental things that divide and also attract, but use them in a way that's productive, that doesn't just limit the mind to that state of concept, the state of concept that exists as maybe colloquially as a good thought or a good intention, but doesn't really have any grounding in the world. There has been no productive part to put a plan into action, perhaps because of fear, to know that whatever plan is put into action will be based on weak foundations. The true understanding of these things, and I sort of am disgusted at myself for bringing it up this way. Maybe I should say of an example that I noticed that is more practical. I happen to know very, very little of the guitar. And I find myself picking the guitar up to play something that is simple, repetitive, but also it's sophisticated enough to carry some emotion. There are sufficient pauses, there are notes that come together to make sense. So I'm interacting with the world in the way of this pattern, in the way of finding the notes that work well together, differentiating, separating out the ones that don't. And what is produced is something that is meaningful and unique to my playing, however simple it might be. And I think we can imagine this on a much larger scale in which somebody possesses a skill or many skills, many bits of understanding of those connective pieces. And by that, they can be productive and they can know things without falling into the deceit of thought that leads one to believe that they are more aware and understanding than they actually are. But the particular knowledge and what it ought to be labeled, I think, is important. I think it can be said that of labels, there can be the more superficial type and the type that mean more. And of the type that mean more, I think of two things. I think of meaning in terms of the individual, on the level of the individual, and then meaning in terms of the broad collective. The collective having a mind to understand what an appropriate label is. On a deep level, I should say. So perhaps to zoom in a little bit farther, it is to identify the depth of psyche in a particular culture that can handle a particular name, let's say, so that a name doesn't slip into nominalism, it doesn't just hollow out in its absence of use, and probably since we're talking about knowledge, I think it would be appropriate to say absence of use, potential absence of use, in the case of not really understanding the name, let's say. But if a person or a collective were to understand the label for a particular type of knowledge, the particular type of knowledge that's necessary to see those notes as they flow through the the goalposts of more fundamental identities. Maybe goalposts aren't the right term, but guiding structural identities. That allow the human mind to develop itself such that its capacities are able to build a cognitive toolkit such that the thoughts that they have do not just stop at some anxious or overly emotional state, but spur into action a type of disposition that is necessary to do real, productive things in the plane that we find ourselves in the physical world. And I say that by making material a criteria, but I do want to make the difference and say that although this is one of my criteria for something being useful knowledge, being able to transition it from that heavenly domain into the earthly, it is also to, I just thought of this now, there's two thoughts, but one supplanted the other. The one is to do the reverse, that is to bring the earthly up into the heavenly. And when the earthly is moved into the heavenly, that process, I think, is different. We start less from the toolkit of mind, but more into the observation of things to find the spirit in mind. Now, this type of approach is a bit foreign to me, but I know that I have experienced it before. Something that I'm weak on, surely. Now, the question is, does that satisfy the label of the knowledge that we are attempting to find? Again, it's a subtle thing. It exists in every discipline, in every pursuit. The fundamentals. And given a solid ground through which we can use these principles, let's say like physics, or philosophy, or in the religious domain, and perhaps these ought not to be separate categories, but rather a united interweaving and overlapping structure of things, as it necessarily must be, given our most recent reflection on the graded nature of more simple identities that participate in larger, more complex identities. Now, larger and more complex doesn't necessarily need be the case physically. We can have sentences that are small or short in nature but have a lot of meaning, where we can have larger sentences or even paragraphs that convey less meaning. Or we can have the opposite, in which a paragraph, just as equally as dense as a single sentence is dense, expands it fourfold or fivefold, whatever. So there are a lot of possibilities here. So Theaetetus says, what do you mean? That we found the philosopher even though we've been looking for the sophist. The visitor says, are we going to say that it takes expertise in dialect to divide things by kinds, and not to think that the same form is a different one, or that a different form is the same? Yes, says Theaetetus. So if a person can do that, he'll be capable of adequately discriminating a single form spread out, although a lot of other things, each of which stands separate from others. In addition, he can discriminate forms that are different from each other, but are included within a single form that's outside of them, or a single form that's connected as a unit throughout many wholes, or many forms that are completely separate from others. That's what it is to know how to discriminate by kinds, how things can associate and how they can't. You know, the farther you go into complexity, there is a risk. There is a risk of seeing the whole, but not of being able to focus on one particular aspect of it, such that productive action is possible. It's easy to have a lot of energy in one place. Again, what comes to mind is the standard by which we measure production. By production, I think there's an extended meaning in my mind, in which production is something that is good. It is something that fulfills, and advances is a term overused, I think. But it fulfills, it renews, it inspires, it lifts, it gives light to, it gives life to. This experience. And all of the things that we may be able to see, but at the expense of our inaction, are something to be glanced at, perhaps to see their utility for what they are, but to be passed by. He'll be capable of adequately discriminating a single form spread out all through a lot of other things, each of which stands separate from the others. And this we see, and this I find as we search. We seemingly are on this crossroad, or at the crossroad between looking straight ahead to see the philosopher and looking aside to see the sophist, because the two run so parallel and yet differ on so fundamental a thing as to be significant almost to make them opposites. In addition, he can discriminate forms that are different from each other, but are included within a single form that's outside of them, or a single form that's connected as a unit throughout many wholes, or many forms that are completely separate from others. Now here I want to say that I complain a lot about the potential through which knowing and understanding can go wrong, by which we can get lost within this interconnectedness of participation and of identity, and have it affect our standard, again, which I refer to as something productive. It can result in material production, but also many other things. Again, this is territory that has been gone over. And I think in time it would probably do us well to keep on developing these standards. But we don't need to go through them all now. We just have to know that there is some standard by which we can measure the usefulness of the knowledge of the interconnectedness among things, and being able to discern, being able to identify. I suppose we don't have to necessarily make a big deal about the highest form when we can see quite simple things right in front of us, in the sense that just getting up this morning, for example, for work, and having these little tasks and responsibilities that we thrust upon ourselves, all of these sorts of things are little microcosms that exercise this knowledge. We identify, we differentiate, we discriminate, we bring things together as a part of the most simple and mundane aspects of life, all the way up to the most complex, of course. So my apologies, but today's a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. Now today happens to be a Sunday evening before a new work week. And like always, the week is turbulent, filled with excitement. Sometimes the mind analyzes this excitement and molds it, formulates it into something productive. Sometimes it's used to build a monster, something to be frightened of, to be scared of. And this, of course, never leads to good outcomes. And as a part of this dialectic that we are going to be engaging in here, I sort of want this to be, in this next segment, for the time that I have to record today, to be on the top of my mind. In the sense that I wish it to be there, Because having a personal investment, I think, is one way to retain information, to commit it to memory. But also it's important because we all struggle with these sorts of things. And since sometimes it can be difficult to find something to focus on in the pure vastness of possibility when it comes to some of these fundamental principles, I think thinking about anxiety, the separation of, the unification of, its perception, all of this is useful for us. So hopefully this maintains throughout this segment. Now the visitor says, and you'll assign this dialectical activity only to someone who has a pure and just love of wisdom. Again, this dialectic activity is that person who has a particular type of expertise to divide things by kinds and not to think that the same form is a different one or that a different form is the same. And then he goes into this extended exposition, and he says a more sophisticated language about the identification of a form that participates in a form or a whole that is broader than it. There are things that are separate in and of themselves. They can be analyzed by their division. There are forms that participate in a whole, and these forms also have parts that participate in it. So here we have the expansion of this sophisticated network that we are building in the mind to understand how the mind works, but how also reality seems to unfold before us. Theaetetus says, you certainly couldn't assign it to anyone else. We'll find that the philosopher will always be in a location like this if we look for him. He's hard to see clearly, too, but not in the same way as the sophist. Why not? Says Theaetetus. The sophist runs off into the darkness of that which is not, which he has had practice dealing with, and he's hard to see because the place is so dark. Isn't that right? It seems to be, says Theaetetus. Now I want to pause here for a moment. This line of thinking is fairly consistent with Old Testament ideas about evil. I'd say to a degree about hell. Absence, darkness, the place for which the mind goes to perhaps the place that it is committed by something that it has done or something that plagues it. Hell is a large place for an unfortunate quality or an unfortunate state that may occupy a person's mind. And oftentimes, whether it be a person who finds themselves in an inattentive landscape or in a place of wicked underpinnings that drives their motions, their behaviors, that general distinction, the darkness, the place of that which is not, is ever present. I think there are plenty of ways in which the mind can convince itself of goodness, of satisfaction that they believe is goodness, but actually that leads them into this place, into the darkened wilderness. Much like the sophist, he may convince himself or convince others that he is a practitioner in the knowledge of wisdom, but in reality he is a wizard that tempts away from practicality and true understanding towards superficiality and towards general absence. The visitor says, but the philosopher always uses reasoning to stay near the form, being. He isn't at all easy to see because that area is so bright, and the eyes of most people's souls can't bear to look at what's divine. That seems just as right as what you said just before. We'll think about the philosopher more clearly soon, if we want to. But as far as the Sophist is concerned, we obviously shouldn't give up until we've gotten a good enough look at him. Fine, says Theaetetus. The visitor says, we've agreed on this. Some kinds will associate with each other, and some won't. Some will to a small extent, and others will associate a great deal. Nothing prevents still others from being all-pervading, from being associated with every one of them. So next let's pursue our account together this way. Let's not talk about every form. That way we won't be thrown off by dealing with too many of them. Instead, let's choose some of the most important ones. First we'll ask what they're like, and next we'll ask about their ability to associate with each other. Even if our grasp of that which is, and that which is not, isn't completely clear, our aim will be to avoid being totally without an account of them. So far as that's allowed by our present line of inquiry, and see whether we can get away with saying that that which is not really is that which is not. That's what we have to do, says Theaetetus. The most important kinds we've just been discussing are that which is, rest, and change. Yes, by far, says Theaetetus. And we say that two of them don't blend with each other. Definitely not. But that which is blends with both of them, since presumably both of them are. Of course. We do have three of them. Yes. So each of them is different from two of them, but is the same as itself. Yes. But what in the world are the same and the different that we've been speaking of? Are they two kinds other than those three, but necessarily always blending with them? And do we always have to think of them as being five and not three? Or have what we've been calling the same and the different turned out, without realizing it, to be among those three? So I'm going to pause here and reflect on this a little bit. There are plenty of things that I think can occupy this category. When we think about things of matters of that which is not and that which is, we think about rest, we think about change. Same and difference are necessary, what I might call qualities of the experience of change and the experience of rest. For in change there is difference. For in rest there is sameness. Now, if I speak about myself, I'm an identifiable unit. I am an identity. There are things that can be said about me that are relevant to my identity. And it doesn't necessarily mean that if I am to identify these qualities, which is necessarily to identify the thing that I am, that makes it something entirely different. It's an expansive pursuit. So if we say of change, for example, we speak of difference, we're suddenly in a new room, let's say, of change. We could also say, there's an argument perhaps that we can say that that which is the same, or that which is changing, and that which is different is synonymous. But in the way that we can be additive and sort of progress the dialectic, when we produce a definition of the word change, we say moving from one state to another. That could be sort of materially, it could be psychologically, any number of domains or dimensions by which we wish to measure or wish to perceive. Difference will manifest in that journey. Now we could say sort of at a superficial level, we look at point A and point B. Again, a change in state of mind, state of opinion, or state of matter. If we look at A and B, we can see quite significant differences between the two states. We can also look at the various intervals between those two spaces and look at the relative change and the relative difference, the way in which one state has changed or been made different. Here I'm using them synonymously, I suppose. Have to also think that among things that are similar and yet occupy some degree of difference, of these two words, for example, I mentioned that there are ways in which we can explore how they're synonymous but also how they're separate from one another. Their overlapping qualities. How do I wish to say this? I think the very discussion about their overlapping qualities is similar to what we're speaking about here, in terms of the identities that participate in relation to one another. Now, in terms of change, if we have to define it, this is outside of me, so I want to be honest here. This is removing some bias that I might have. This is why I find it useful to define terms. So this is from the internet. Change is a transition or process by which something becomes different over time. It requires at least two temporal states. Difference, a relation between two things or states, such that they are not the same. This may or may not involve time. So change is the process, and difference is the relation, logical or ontological. So this is fairly consistent with what I was saying, I suppose, in the sense that change is the bigger picture, it is broader. Indifference is more of the reasoning, the distinction, the way of change. So with regard to change, if something is changed, it is different from itself at a prior time. So for example, the tree was green, now it is red, therefore it has changed. There is a difference between its past and present state. In terms of difference, two things can be different without either one changing. A rock is different from a tree, but neither one has changed. So to the question, are they two kinds other than those three, but necessarily always blending with them? Now here comes to mind something that I said earlier. I think I used the word quality to refer to different. Or I think I used the word category. But I think I should have used the word quality. Both somewhat work, loosely, but quality has a particular way of describing it. It becomes a bit difficult when we think about being, as many things are. Are they two kinds other than those three? There is a degree of otherness, surely, between difference and change. And there surely is a way of blending. But to go farther and to say, do we have to think of them as being 5 and not 3? I don't think it's necessary. And the reason is, although it's not impossible to do so, but it wouldn't be practical, because if we think about change and rest, these are fundamental terms. If we add difference and we add sameness, we are not speaking at the same level. We're speaking inside of the beings that we had mentioned, the forms that we had mentioned. Again, to go back to my previous analogy that I got from the internet. Let me try to find it here. Well, maybe not the analogy per se, but change being the process and difference being the relation. But again, difference is operating within that principality of change. It is an operator of logic that is provided to us so that we can understand the identity of change. And I know I'm focusing on change and difference, but we can use these terms interchangeably. That I could take sameness and apply it to change, and also to rest, and difference to rest as well. Theaetetus responds to all of this by saying maybe. The visitor continues, but change and rest are certainly not different or the same. Why not, says Theaetetus. Whatever we call change and rest in common can't be either one of them. Why not, says Theaetetus. Then change would rest and rest would change. In both cases, if either change or rest comes to be either same or different, then it will force the other to change to the contrary of its own nature, since it will share in its contrary. Theaetetus says, absolutely. The visitor continues, and both do share in the same and in the different. Theaetetus says, yes. So let's think about what this means here. The visitor makes the claim, we call change and rest in common, can't be either one of them. He says, but change and rest are certainly not different or the same. Now, we've been here before. We've been to the place that identifies the point at which, when two identities come into contact, there's a point at which their identities cannot maintain each other if they fall into each other, because one would become the opposite. Then anyway, says the visitor, let's not say that change is the same or the different, nor that rest is. All right. But do we have to think of that which is and the same as one thing? Theaetetus says maybe. But if that which is and the same don't signify distinct things, then we say that change and rest both are. We'll be labeling both of them as being the same. But certainly that's impossible, says Theaetetus. Okay, so we found ourselves a bit of a paradox in the sense that of change and of rest, they both participate, or they have the beings of difference and sameness participate in both of these, change and rest. And while it is difficult to identify exactly how these things participate in change and rest, especially if we say that if change is to remain the same, then isn't this something that is akin to rest, the stoppage of motion? I think that there is more to be explored there, but I think the visitor does well to say, let's not say that change is the same or the different, nor that rest is. And so we move then to something that is much broader, that which is. In a similar sort of light, I think we have to return to our graduated sense of viewing things, of viewing reality. Fractal is another way of seeing this. It is like the Russian doll, in which a smaller doll fits inside of a larger one of a similar form and facial expression. Everything is essentially the same except for the dimension of size. So when we move from one level of participation in that which is at rest or that which is changing, we move to the level of participation of that which is, we can just as equally say that that which is at rest or that which changes participates in that which is, just like difference and sameness may participate in change or rest. But it's not a totalizing thing. It cannot be. As we've established already, the identity of, or the name, the meaning of the terms would be altered to a degree that would destroy the meaning that is encapsulated by it. That is by the name. Do we have to think of that which is and the same as one thing? He continues, if that which is and the same don't signify distinct things, distinct being something that is recognizably different in nature from something else of a similar type, something that is clear, something that is marked, something that is definite. So here, there are so many things I think that can be said. The first thing that comes to mind is that that which is exists in this domain in which we can think about the concept, but it can also exist in connection to something else that is, like for example, a penny, or myself, for example. In that way, we can identify something that is distinct. But if we talk about the concept itself of that which is, where the concept really doesn't refer to anything distinct, and the same with the same, then we are left in a strange territory, and I wonder about the territory. I wonder about the productiveness of the territory. He continues, then we say that change and rest both are. We'll be labeling both of them as being the same. Now they share in sameness because of being. But just because they share in being, it doesn't necessarily mean that they share all qualities the same way.
Now Theaetetus follows up with this and he says, but certainly that's impossible. So it's impossible for the same and that which is to be one. I suppose so. Shall we take the same as the fourth in addition to the other three forms? Theaetetus says, of course. Well then, do we have to call the different a fifth? Or should we think of it and that which is as two names for one kind? Maybe. But I think you will admit that some of those which are said by themselves, but some are always said in relation to other things. Of course, says Theaetetus. So to pause for a moment, we can imagine a category, the category of coin. There are different kinds of coins, we can say. There is a dime and there is a penny. They share in coinedness, but they differ on the particulars of their qualities. Some of those which are said by themselves. Now what can we say of this idea? Some of those which are said by themselves. There may be an issue of contextual relevance here. When we refer to something that is, we may not necessarily refer to the entire chain of associations. But some are always said in relation to other things. But the different is always said in relation to another, isn't it? Yes, says Theaetetus. Now why would we say that the different is always in relation to another? Because difference requires two identities. In order to identify difference, there must be a comparison. That for one object to be different from another, there must be some way in which one can identify separation. We could think of it in terms of qualities. We could think about it in terms of different dimensions, about distance apart, about the separation of something based on its weight, or the way that it reflects light, its color. Again, we could say that these are qualities as well. But it wouldn't be if that which is and the different were completely distinct. If the different shared in both kinds, the way that which is does, then some of the things that are different would be different without being different in relation to anything different. In fact, though, it turns out that whatever is different definitely has to be what it is from, something that's different. So quite a confusing statement there, or a series of statements. Let's try to break this down. Now I'm thinking I might, after this page, read the next page in its entirety, because I'm starting to grow a bit tired of the reading small amounts and reflecting. I sort of prefer the 2-page and then reflection on each segment. But nonetheless, Plato is always like this. Different sections warrant different types of interpretation, I suppose. So starting with the first sentence, but it wouldn't be if that which is and the different weren't completely distinct. Now, this matter of being distinct there's an idea of separation here between that which is and difference. But of course there cannot be a separation there between that which is and difference. Otherwise difference would not be. If the difference shared in both kinds, the way that that which is does, now both kinds I'm assuming to mean that which is at rest and that which changes, then some of the things that are different would be different without being different in relation to anything different. So let's break this part down. This is the most confusing part, I would say. I think the most important thing that we have to understand is actually something that precedes that, which is if the difference shared. Now this gets at the heart of things, I think, is what exactly is the relationship? What are they sharing? And he doesn't really go into detail. We've gone into detail before. If he doesn't share in both kinds the way that that which is does, now what is the way that that which is shares rest and change? Well, we could say that rest and change are, and so they are something that is, and so by that being, they exist within that which is. Now this relationship is, as we enter into thinking about the relationship, there is a dynamic by which we can imagine it as like an inside and an outside almost. That what is inside of that which is includes rest and change. But we can say that rest and change are concepts that participate as a consequence of being. And because they have this being, because they are, that what is afforded by that which is, or thingness in general, existence, being, is a relation to, or a potential relation to other beings. Difference, if it is to participate in this world, is to have being. It is to have distinctness, to have its own meaning. Some of the things that are different would be different without being different in relation to anything different. Now we could take rest and change, these participators in this grand principality of being, and we could say that there is a difference between the two. That the state of their relation is possible to afford difference. Something that is unlike. There is a contrast between the two. But just because they contrast doesn't mean that it devolves into something that is not. difference is this divider. But despite the division of being, there is still the thing that is, that unites it under that banner of being, of existence. Some of the things that are different would be different without being different. In relation to anything different. Now there is a thought that comes to mind in the sense that when we are comparing the two things, such as rest and change, we have just these. We don't have a network of difference that leads to the identity of change and rest, but I suppose we can build one. But to continue with the visitor, in fact, though, it turns out that whatever is different definitely has to be what it is from, something that's different. Just want to pause here once more. I did some thinking, some aided thinking, using some previous analogies. And so I just wanted to pause and to regroup and regather. I think I'm getting a little too far afield from where I should be. But I don't think confusion is unwarranted here. The general idea of difference, I think it must be said that difference must exist as a concept of relation and not something of a standalone, let's say. Now, I've been bouncing back and forth between the idea that's brought up by the visitor, how difference can participate in being the same way that rest or change can. Difference. Earlier I said that difference is something that is. And I suppose we can say on some level it is something that is. As a concept, concepts are things. Concepts are things that are. But this is a particular type. This is a relational concept. And by it being a relational concept, we identify it based on certain conditions. That difference is the manifestation between something that can be identified other than something else. Now, if all of reality, again, I've used this analogy before, was this penny that I hold in my hand, inside of it, we would understand we would understand difference based on the relationship among the different parts. To even speak outside of it wouldn't make any sense, because there is no outside. It is as it is. But again, as a useful thought experiment, we think of the penny as an inside-outside dynamic. But from the outside, we are afforded a particular perspective. I think we can see more clearly, although it's difficult to imagine that all of reality can be seen from an outside, given removing this paradox. It's easy to see how distinction and how difference operates in the system. And it's not necessarily a matter of difference participating in the same way of that which is as another concept. It's a matter of relation and identification. And so in order for it to be, it cannot be something that is independent, other than a concept. But if it's a concept, then we identify it more so on the nature of concept, but not on the nature of difference. If we identify it on the nature of difference, then it must be of something, or has to be what it is from something that's different. Again, a relational difference. Theaetetus responds that is exactly the way it is. And we do have to call the nature of the different a fifth among the forms we're choosing. Now here again, the nature of the different. Theaetetus says yes. And we're going to say that it pervades all of them, since each of them is different from the others, not because of its own nature, but because of sharing in the type of the different. Absolutely. Let's take up each of the five one by one and say this. What? First, let's say that change is completely different from rest. Shall we say that? Yes. So today is a new day, and I would like to issue an apology for my inability to understand some of the previous lines. I was just reading over it again and listened to a little bit of what I had to say about things, and eventually I figured it out with some help from AI, but I wish I didn't do that. I read it over again so I could understand it a little bit better. And I think the issue that I had was, specifically with the line, the sentence, if the different shared in both kinds the way that which is does, then some of the things that are different would be different without being different in relation to anything different. I think that I had an issue there because it just doesn't make any sense. It's meant to not make any sense. It's meant to point out a paradox. That whatever is different definitely has to be what it is from something that's different. So there has to be this ground, this relational ground, and I think I went over that, but just to get that off my chest because this is a new day and new thoughts and everything. The other thing I want to say is that my plan is probably to finish interpreting the way that I have been through these 2 pages. I know that this is not if one is to listen to this, they're not able to see where I'm at on the page, but out of the 2 pages that I'm on, I'm sort of at the third quarter of the first, and I have the second to go before I turn the page. But I'll probably most likely revert to reading the 2 pages again. Okay. So we are talking now about the nature of the different, and potentially calling it a fifth among the forms that we're choosing. And I want to reflect a moment on the forms that we are establishing thus far. We have that which is, which seems, at least in my estimation, to be one of the most important forms. We have the same, we have change, and we have rest. These are the principles around which we understand reality, or in a way, I think we can say that we, the pillars, the foundations that we participate with, such that it can support our minds. We can say it more in an objective manner, such that these forms are not the result of our observation is the result of the way that they are. Now, I think that there's some issues that I have with that, but we'll leave that as it is. So there's this concept that we are being introduced to, that the different is pervading all of these forms, and yet it is still being debated if we should call, or we are considering if we should call this a fifth of the fundamental forms. I ask myself the question, how does it pervade all of these things? Well, it pervades all of them because it is something that identifies relationships. It's a relational term. Now, of the term, I think there's a better word that we can use. It is not just a word. We could say that it is a concept. We could say that it is a difference is a fundamental concept. But it involves a particular constant of nature that is of distinction, that is of identification, that in order to have something that is distinct, there has to be identifiable things about that thing that is different. So I could take two things in front of me. We have the penny and we have the pen, both of which are, so they share in certain qualities, or they share in certain reality, a certain reality. We could say that there are certain qualities on a more superficial level, like they're both solid, let's say. But they're fundamentally different in terms of what they are, what the purpose is, their shape, their size, their weight. And it is by difference that we are able to identify and recognize. Difference, in the fundamental sense, maybe I'll say, when we consider the pillars of reality. Now I'm going to run a physical exercise here, and perhaps it can be heard on the microphone. I'm gathering 5 different pennies, and maybe this is not the best way to go about it. Maybe I should gather different coins. So give me one moment. Hopefully this is not too obnoxious to the microphone. So I have a quarter, I have a nickel, I have a penny. I'm trying to find something that is a little bit different, but still kind of a coin. I wish I had a dime. I'm not sure that I do. And I do. I found one. Okay. So there are these 4 items that are in front of me. Let's ignore for a moment that they're all coins, but they're different identities: penny, dime, nickel, quarter. These are the 4 that we have: that which is, sameness, rest, and change. The fact that they are all different suggests that this principle of difference is an important one. And so for that, I have this 1 troy ounce, 0.9995 silver, from 2003. It's a picture of Santa. So kind of staying within the money realm, I guess. It's some value to it. And so I've placed it in the middle of these 4 principles, sort of as a uniting element of them all. The irony is that it is by difference that we see a commonality, or that we can see the identities of each one of these. I like to say that one more time. It is by difference that we are able to see the identities of things. And there's another distinction that we are introduced to here, that I think is important to chew on for a moment. He says, not because of its own nature, but because of sharing in the type of the different. Now, what can we say of this? There's an important distinction between type and nature. So we know that type is related to classification, about grouping things that share similar characteristics. Nature is something fundamental. I'm using that word quite loosely, so I don't want to use it too loosely and forgo its meaning. But what we are concerned with when we say the nature of difference, we're talking about its essence, its being. And I find it difficult to differentiate between a type of difference and the being of difference. I suppose it's subtle, but if we take, for example, the term organism, there are plenty types of organisms, but seeing it at this level doesn't necessarily describe the essence of the organism. It just helps us classify and organize. So in the way that I had interpreted this initially is, I think, more of an essential level. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but it is easy to see that because of difference, we can identify the way in which something is different. The classification of difference, in which why the penny is different from the nickel, why the nickel is different from the quarter, why sameness is different from rest, why change is different from sameness. So the visitor says, let's take up each of the five one by one and say this. First, let's say that change is completely different from rest. Shall we say that? Yes. So it is not rest. Not at all, says Theaetetus. But it is, because it shares in that which is. Yes. Then again, change is different from the same. Pretty much. So it is not the same. No. But still, it was the same, we said, because everything has a share of that. Definitely. So in my mind, I think about this sameness as it relates to the process that we have just undergone here. We are in the process of determining in greater detail what this term means. And actually, I was just thinking that I wish we had some sort of specific focus on the same, because we really haven't gone through sameness yet. But here we are. So for most of these things, we are not really given specific reasons why something is not something else. So for example, that change is completely different from rest. Some of these we don't have to, because it's obvious. They are opposites. And at the most fundamental layer, we can say at least it is something. That even though they are different, it doesn't mean that they are nothing. They are something that is. The visitor continues, then again, change is different from the same. Now this is another thing that we would almost intuitively recognize as almost opposite, in the sense that of opposites, if we say that something changes, we could take any sort of example that we see in our experience. We could take condition A versus condition B. So condition A, I have my little 5 items set up here. I can move two items out of the way, and now their position is different. So there has been some change to the system. The change can be identified in some way. Let me move them back. And we could say that because of this change, that A and B, the conditions, are not the same. But we can also determine and think about, as we will soon, of change itself, where sameness exists. We'll save that for a moment. The visitor continues, he says, so it is not the same, says Theaetetus. That is, change is different from the same, so it is not the same. But still, it was the same, we said, because everything has a share of that. So everything has a share of what seems to be the same. And so if everything has to have the share of the same, but is not the same, then what can be said? The visitor says, we have to agree without any qualms that change is the same and not the same. An interesting statement, and this is here where I mentioned that we have to speak of change itself. Again, if it is to be permeated by difference or by sameness, then we have to understand typologically how this is true. What type of change would include sameness? We could also ask the question, what type of change would include difference? A bit of an easier question to answer, I think. But of the first, the visitor says, when we say that it's the same and not the same, we aren't speaking the same way. So, just what I said. There's a way of seeing change that includes this sameness, and there's a way of seeing change that implies something else. When we say that it's the same, that's because it shares in the same in relation to itself. So this is the most fundamental argument that we can make. That change is that shares in sameness because even though it possesses so many qualities that are distinct or different from that which is the same or sameness, change itself in its essence, not necessarily in its type, and maybe this is here where I misspoke earlier, change in its essence has a fundamental meaning. It has a fundamental identity. And because of this identity, it cannot be changed itself. Otherwise, the concept, the principle, would not exist. The visitor continues, but when we say it's not the same, that's because of its association with the different. Now this is the other that I had mentioned about change. So you have the side that is influenced by sameness and the side that is influenced by difference. So I suppose we could still use the typological here. We don't have to entirely abandon it. Because of its association with the different, change is separated from the same, and so becomes not it, but different. So that it's right to say that it's not the same. So here's our two ways of seeing. One in which sort of the essence of change is the same, to maintain its identity, and the aspect of change by its function, by which includes that quality or type, principle of difference. So if change itself ever somehow had a share in rest, there would be nothing strange about labeling it resting. Theaetetus says that's absolutely right, as long as we admit that some kinds will blend with each other and some won't. That, though, we demonstrated earlier before we came to this point, and we showed that by nature it has to be so. Of course. To repeat, says the visitor, change is different from different here is in italics, just as it's other than both the same and rest. So I want to pause for a moment and reflect on the concept of blending. What comes to mind is a bit of a jarbled situation. I have a bunch of thoughts that just sort of randomly collide, and then I have no thoughts. On one hand, I say this almost incessantly, that from a principled point of view, it can be kind of difficult because we're talking about things that are so close to the eyes, so to speak. Like, for example, if I picked up the dime, and remember that out of these 5 pieces, the dime is associated with one of our 5 forms. If I put this so close to my eye that I couldn't see anything around it, it would be quite difficult to observe and to make sense of exactly what I'm looking at. Something that applies so fundamentally to so many different things, I think can be usefully observed and witnessed in practical, real-world examples or illustrations. So, for example, I think about life. I think about the blending of life that exists. Not only in the interaction among species, but also the consuming of an identity for the maintenance of another. Let's say, for example, that I may eat steak to maintain myself, so there's this participation in change so that I can rest. The two are closely related. That may not get to the heart of it, though. I'm going to read it one more time, the statement that preceded Theaetetus's blending statement. So if change itself ever somehow had a share in rest, there would be nothing strange about labeling it resting. So let me ask the question then, how can change participate or have a share in rest? We just went through the potential through which sameness can share in change, insofar as change can share in rest. We wouldn't necessarily say the same, that change is fundamental to rest itself. Just like we would say that sameness is fundamental to the identity of change. But we can say that by something to be at rest, to be stationary, not in motion, there has to be something that is relative to it, that is in motion, that is changing. By its relative or relational positioning, we can identify its rested position or rested state. We could take something in the blackness of space and push it, and it could gain speed quite rapidly. And yet, if two things were moving at the same speed, we would say that they seem, at least from a certain perspective, that they are at rest. Or without proper background context, it seems like they're not moving. But of course, if we were observing them, we would see them moving. To the participant itself, moving at that speed through space, they probably wouldn't be able to tell much if they were moving. No air, nothing to ground them, no gravity. Nothing to reference their motion by. Perhaps their vestibular apparatus may allow them to perceive some type of motion, but it's difficult to say. But I bring this up because of the potential ways in which we can see rest. There's a way in which change can be all about it. So, for example, I may be at rest. I can say that I am at rest. But there are things that are within me that are certainly not at rest, that are changing. There are many physiological processes that are taking place. There are subtle movements, perhaps even in the building that I'm in. The earth is moving, the earth is spinning, we're moving through space. So there's a lot of change that is occurring around this rested state, this relationally rested state. Picking up where we left off, the visitor says, to repeat, change is different from different, just as it's other than both, the same, and rest. It has to be, says Theaetetus. So in a way it is different and not different, according to what we've said. Right. So what's next? Are we going to say that change is different from the first three, but not from the fourth? In spite of the fact that we've agreed that there were 5 things we were going to investigate? How could we do that? We can't admit that there are fewer of them than there appear to be just now. So shall we go on fearlessly contending that change is different from that which is? So I think that this is a good place to stop. I'm going to continue next time with episode 8, and we will continue with our traditional reading of the 2 pages and interpretation. So until next time.